yeah, and just say, welcome to the third day. Hope everyone's still raring to go, bright and breezy. Yeah, and of course, you've probably heard it enough from us, but do remember we've got the exhibitor hall as well, gaming arcade downstairs. Please go play with all the games, try it out. Obviously, I'm speaking to people interested in games, so you're here at this session. But so if you haven't already, do go and try them all out. And Normandie is down there as well. So I shall get on to start by, so in today's talk, Normandie, a documentary video game by Sam Bouton. And just a little bit about Sam he's a storyteller specialising in games and XR. As a founder of On the March, a New York indie game studio, he's currently leading the development of Normandie, a documentary video game, an immersive exploration of Jewish refugee stories supported by the Claims Conference, Maimonides Fund, and a Games of Change. His past work includes 1978 Revolution Black Friday, BAFTA SXSW Game Awards nominee, Hero at Sundance, Tribeca Storyscapes winner, and Fire Escape, which is NYFF Tribeca and VIFF. So, good histories. Anyway, so I shall hand it over to Sam, and he can tell us all about your latest project.
Thanks. Thank you, Ben. And thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here early on the last day of the conference. I appreciate getting out of bed and attending a conversation about Normandy. I am Sam, as Ben just said. I'm going to talk a little bit about this gaming project, its inspirations, the archival research behind it, as well as some other just discoveries from being in the process of game development for nearly a decade now. As a brief introduction, Ben covered it better than I could have, but I sometimes describe myself as a very accidental game designer, in that I went to school to make documentaries and fell into the wild west of interactive storytelling about 10 years ago. My work has mostly focused on creating historical and immersive video game content, the first of which is a video game 1979 Revolution Black Friday, which was a choose-your-own-adventure cinematic video game that took place during the events of the Iranian Revolution in the late 1970s. Making that game involved partnering with Farsi voice actors, historians, photojournalists who were in Tehran during the revolution. And that game was, for me, kind of like drinking from the fire hose in terms of what interactive storytelling could do. And it got me really excited as I started to work in XR, in VR, and AR experiences, Fire Escape and Hero, as were mentioned before, which are both really cool projects. But unfortunately, one of the things about virtual reality that I think we all know here too is it's very difficult to experience them often. So one of the things that I love about games is that accessibility and ease of use as a platform thing, and is part of the reason that I return to them time and time again. I also want to acknowledge that I am one of a group of people working on this project. I have a team of collaborators in New York, in Brooklyn. I am the creative director and head of a studio on March. And I'm also supported by amazing organizations, including Claims Conference and other groups that are here. So thank you all so much for that support. Games are truly the most collaborative medium. They take a village in many ways. So I always like to just shout that out and pay that respect as well. Okay, so I want to start by telling a brief story. And this is the Dreyfus family. They're a Swiss Jewish family living in Zurich in the mid-1930s, and they're also my ancestors. The little guy wearing the big suit on the right is my grandfather, Robert. That picture is like 1935, about then. And in late August of 1939, the Dreyfuses board an ocean liner called the SS Normandie that's traveling from Le Havre, France, to New York for what's ostensibly a family vacation. And what they don't realize when they board the ship is that it's the last voyage that the Normandie is ever going to make. The ship arrives into New York on August 29th, 1939, just a couple of days before Germany invades Poland and the Second World War begins. And for my family and the more than 2,000 passengers aboard the ship, they suddenly find themselves stranded very far from home. On board this final voyage were an amalgamation and mosaic of European Jewry, including my family, but also Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, French, and all over the world. A little bit more about the Normandie. It's an interesting ship in that the 1930s is it's the age of the ocean liner. An ocean liner is a symbol of a nation's strength, soft power, cultural power, in the way that television and other media is how America has a lot of cultural domination currently. The Normandie initially sailed in 1935. As a fun fact, it was like a competing ship with the Queen Mary, which was the British flagship at the time. And the Normandie was actually not as well filled as the Queen Mary often because of its gaudy Art Deco glamour. In an age when class and relationship to travel was quickly changing, people wanted quick and ease of travel rather than glamour and luxury. But the ship existed in this liminal intermediary time period, and I think that's what's really interesting for me about focusing on it as a game. The ship also had a strange second life post its final voyage. It was waylaid in New York Harbor, where it was actually tethered next to the Queen Mary. So these two former rival ships were joined together in New York Harbor, where they were stuck for years while the war broke out in the Atlantic. And after Pearl Harbor, the US Navy actually started to convert the ship into a Navy transport vessel that they christened the USS Lafayette. But unfortunately, I think they couldn't read the French manuals, so they took out all the fireproofing on the ship, and it caught on fire during its retrofitting and sunk in New York Harbor, where it lied in the harbor for the remainder of the war. At the time, there was a lot of theories that it was German sabotage, but it actually was just American ineptitude. And they actually kind of buried that because they didn't want that to be known. But even that rumor mill of the idea that German refugees were responsible for the sabotage of the ship years later, I think feeds into some of the themes that I'm going for with this project as well. I'm going to show a teaser trailer now of the project that I'm going to hopefully play the audio as well. Give you a little bit more about how it looks and feels. Sorry, it's playing from my... I have to exit this really quickly. Sound. Okay, let's see if this works.
Quelle est votre religion,
Monsieur Dreyfus.
People aboard this ship. So tell me, what have you come here to escape?
Awesome. Cool, so I'm going to talk about the design of the project in a second, but I want to continue with the inspirations behind it. The first and foremost of which is a diary that my great-grandfather, Max, kept while on board the ship. And the story of this diary is interesting because this is something that really only entered my life about 5 years ago, after I've been working in games for a long time, and was considering leaving games and moving back to more linear media. And as I started reading through his diary, I was caught both by the details of what he wrote about and what he left out. In full disclosure, a lot of the diary is describing the silverware and other things on the ship too, but there are snippets inside of it talking about Shabbat service with the cantor, seeing warships, the telegram and radio coverage of the ship being turned off because of fear of German U-boat sabotage as they crossed the Atlantic. As an aside, I found an interesting observation from someone aboard the ship that said that they were placing bets on if the war had broken out while the ship was sailing because they weren't able to send messages. And when they got to New York, they asked a journalist at the harbor, has the war started? They said no, even though it was about to, and people won and lost a lot of money. People were making bets on it aboard. So the diary of my great-grandfather provides the core of the project's research for me. And through his words, I started to spread my archival research to look at the other stories of people on the ship and see how it converged or diverged from the things that he was saying. And that actually had a bunch of interesting observations as well. I kind of am cheekingly calling the game a documentary video game, but it's also quite literally a document video game, in that it's made up of tactile archival resources from a variety of libraries. Family archives that I have access to through family in New York and also in Switzerland, where certain members of my family return to, but also archives in partnership with the Center for Jewish History in New York, where I'm based, the Museum of the City of New York, which has incredible pictures of the Normandie. I think they took publicity stills in 1935, so they have these incredible schematic architectural maps. Even public archives like Ancestry.com, where you can access the manifests and the directories of the ship, and then specifically Holocaust archives, including the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York as well. And I think the mosaic of these different sources is really interesting for me personally as a designer, because in full disclosure, I'm actually kind of what's the word? Lazy isn't the right word, but I like research for me has always been key in terms of storytelling, because I think from an artist standpoint, the way to combat cliche is just through embodiment and immersivity into these platforms. So I've spent a ton of time digging through CJH, reading through old Atlantic and Time periodicals, and found that as a really useful resource for research, but also as assets to actually put into the game itself, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Other influences. So I had access to my great-grandfather's diary and was thinking about the gaps in storytelling processes that I wanted to explore. But that isn't in and of itself a game, right? Like I think when we think about a game, we think about challenge, we think about rules, we think about structure. And I got really inspired by this picture on the left, which is a photo from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's archives. And it is of a deck of patience cards, which is another way to talk about solitaire, that was brought over by a German Jewish refugee on an ocean liner. And through this tattered box of cards, I started to dig into this idea of the archival card games that people played on these oceanic voyages. If you think about it, it makes sense. The 1930s, there's no television, right? Their radio coverage is really sporadic at sea, so what are people doing in these liminal spaces of boredom for 5 or 6 days? They're playing games. They're doing sort of like transient activities. And if any of you have ever, I had never before working on this project actually played solitaire physically, but it takes 40 minutes. like the ritual of setting it up is like, you can tell that it existed in a time before the Windows version of it and before our mobile versions of it that make it much faster. The ritual of it, of setting it up slowly and doing all of these cards is a component to pass the time. So I think the idea of a game based around passing a time and of a people that were stuck in the space of semi-agency are interesting thematic things for me to combine as well. And then beyond the actual idea of playing cards, exile fiction was also really interesting for me too. In addition to my great-grandfather, some like much better well-known authors like Isaac Bashevis Singer and other people that have done incredible work in memory fiction and thinking about how to recall a space that doesn't necessarily exist other than in your mind. I also got really inspired by memory maps during the Holocaust that people would create of shuttles and their villages to try to reconstruct something that they lacked full context of as well. It also kind of extends in a cool way beyond card games into board games and other formats. This is also from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's archives. And this is a board game that Kindertransport Refugee made on one of these ocean liners. So you actually, what's really interesting for me too is you have children creating their own game and game-like experiences on these oceanic voyages to different levels of aesthetic and game fidelity. And I think playing with that tactileness and that relationship of different ages' reactions to travel was also something that felt really fun for me. As a quick aside to wrap up the inspiration parts of it, this is a photo of a manifest page from the Normandie. And to expand on my own family's story, the story of this voyage wasn't something that I knew a lot about growing up, but the only thing that I knew about it was that they were going on a family trip to New York for the World's Fair. And what was told to me at the time by my grandfather, who I called Grand-Père, who was this intense Swiss man living on the Upper East Side of New York, was that they were traveling to New York for the World's Fair when the war happened to break out. Fast forward to 2 years ago when I started working on this project, and one of the first things that I did was I got access to the ship's manifest on Ancestry.com. And it's an incredible resource, which I think most of us are familiar with, but also from a game design perspective and a storyteller's perspective, it's amazing because you have the locations people came from, their ages, their height, their eye color, their occupation, their last known address, the languages they speak. It's really like a statistics screen in a video game, almost in a lot of ways. So I thought that that was a really great resource. And in the process of going through this and just doing my due diligence, I've highlighted in the bottom section here, there's a section on the manifest that responds to the quotas, the type of visas that people had. And my expectation when I did this was that I was gonna find that my family had an immigration visa, but to my surprise, I found a Q visa, which is a quota visa, which all of a sudden realized that the story that I had been told as a kid by my grandfather, who was a teenager on the boat, wasn't the full story, wasn't necessarily the true story. He's passed, so I'm not sure if he knew the true story even. So all of a sudden, there's a degree of Russian dolling, Rashomaning of history and memory that's intergenerational, that's threading deeper and deeper. So that discovery, that feeling of moving between these different levels of knowledge and discovery for myself is the experience that I'm trying to curate and offer to players when they're playing this game. And I think games are really, really good at that. And I'm gonna do a little bit of a divergence now to do like a game nerd part of this presentation, because I think that's kind of like, it's always really helpful. When I came into games, I didn't know a lot about how they were made or how they're constructed. And I think there's a lot of like really, really good information that's out there. So I'm stealing some stuff from this dapper looking gentleman, Sam Lake, on the bottom left, who's the creative director of a large gaming studio, a very popular gaming studio, Remedy, in Finland. And he has a really good quote here that I love that's talking about how film, music, books, and all these other mediums are elements that can exist inside of a game. In the case of Remedy's work, they actually use full motion video, meaning live action video, and they often put it inside of their game projects to create cinematic effect. And I think this quote is great because when we think about previous mediums, film is the hybridity of photography and theater. All mediums are built on components of the ones that come before it, and I think that games, when people think about games as a separate thing, I think that's kind of a divergent argument from what they're really good at. So the approach that I'm trying to take of this merging of formats, I think, is really prescient to what and exciting for me for what games can do. Related to that is like, this is like a very like academic games term that's called the magic circle, which is this idea that like a game is a space where the normal rules are suspended. When we play a game, we talk about abstraction. Regardless of how simulation-y and real a game is, you're never going to actually, you don't have to breathe when you're playing most games. You don't have to, it depends on if it's a game where you have to eat or do certain actions. So metaphors and abstractions are really good tools in a game designer's toolkit. And I have a quote in here as well from a former professor of mine at New York University, which is games are the architecture of participation. And I think that's also a really important thing to keep in mind when it comes to designing these types of games. Especially like a game that I'm trying to label as a documentary video game that might have a tendency to pull more towards edutainment or static gaming experiences. So I think those are really important things to think about, especially engaging in this type of cross-medium disciplines. And I think my solution, and this isn't a one-size-fits-all, but for me the solution is, I'm borrowing this Greek word, apophenia, which I really like, which is the, tendency to perceive patterns out of random or unrelated data. And I think that games are really good at this. Again, another game nerd reference, there are larger games like Dark Souls and these large gaming universes that don't do a lot of explaining about what the world is, but rather invites you and encourages you to discover for yourself. And I think the more that games can borrow that mentality, the more that other mediums can borrow that mentality of storytelling, it's a really powerful thing. Another example of this is like when we play chess, what we're doing when we're playing chess isn't real, but we're assigning real rules to it. We're assigning real world scenarios to it as well. So we're creating tension and meaning and evocative emotions out of things that are abstracted. In the case of Normandy, that is through a mosaic of these different archival materials that I'll go into a little bit more in a second, but I just wanted to kind of set up that stage for everyone here. For me, it's also a world building technique. So what I'm using Normandy to do is take all of these different archives and resources and composite them into a format that I think is palatable and accessible for audiences, which is a card game. So using playing cards that represent these different archival sources, whether it's photographs, diary entries, tickets, visas, and other things that create some type of abstract aesthetic template. I have some concept art here on the bottom as well as some of my family's actual visa information. But I think what's really important and interesting and visceral for me for this project is that we feel like we're stepping into a world that doesn't begin when we enter it. This isn't a hero's journey story. This is a story in a world that's in chaos and is unfair and doesn't logically make sense. And I think preserving some of those qualities for a player activates that curiosity engine and gets them even more engaged in the game. I think also it would be kind of nice to just show talk about the prototypes, because everything I just said was kind of abstract, and I think, again, games are kind of a black box and people don't have a lot of great information about how they're made. So I'm a big believer in showing your work and just getting stuff out there and talking about it. So the game initially began as this Twine prototype that I initially built in HTML. And for anyone who's not familiar, Twine is like an interactive, a hypertext writing engine that's really simple, really usable actually. Like if you've used Microsoft Word, you can probably use Twine. It's a very simple syntax and allows you to create branching storytelling in a really easy and malleable way. I worked with incredible collaborators who made this look very different than a normal Twine game using JavaScript and CSS. So like, if you open it, it's not gonna, if you start fooling around it, it's not gonna look like this. But what's great about Twine is that it's easy to prototype and even easier to deploy. It's HTML based, you send someone a web link and they can play it. And I think that in an age when narrative games are increasingly competing against social multiplayer Fortnite experiences, having something that doesn't require large downloads or a PlayStation or other types of like higher spec platforms is really interesting and important too. I'm actually going to show a trailer from this prototype to give you an idea of where the game started and also how it's evolved over time too. So I'll show this trailer first.
Billet, donnez-le-moi maintenant. My ticket? Un moment. S'il vous plaît. Quand reviendrez-vous? Vous partez en voyage en famille?
Oops, sorry. Could you all see the video?
Billet, donnez-le-moi maintenant. Billet, donnez-le-moi. Billet. Billet, donnez-le-moi maintenant. Billet, donnez...
Okay. Maybe I'll just play it.
Billet, donnez-le-moi maintenant. My ticket? Un moment. S'il vous plaît. Quand reviendrez-vous? Vous partez en voyage en famille?
What is your occupation, Monsieur Dreyfus?
Darling, let me talk with the customs.
Telegram for you, son.
Thanks. I pray for your safety while I wait to
Telegram saying,
Take this. Do you know how to read Yiddish?
There's something you're not telling us.
3,000 people about this ship. So tell me, what have you come here to escape?
Baruch אתה אדוני, שומע תפילה.
Cool. Okay, let me go back into this. Okay, cool. So you could also see from that teaser trailer that there's a lot of simulation going on there. It's very immersive. I'm using like immersive audio, leaning heavily into sensory storytelling, but it's also an experience where you're playing as different members of the Dreyfus family, my ancestors, for anyone who's joining late, who were aboard the final voyage of the Normandie. And I found that as a really evocative, emotional hook to bring people into the game world. So fast forward to working on the larger game in Unity and a game engine. I'm working with a larger team now. We're creating assets, we're brainstorming, we're creating new mechanics, we're thinking about exciting new developments for the project. And we have a few pillars that we're starting to put together. Everything is cards. It's fun to make a game that has limitations, so everything's gonna feel like a card game, and we're gonna use that kind of aesthetic. We're also gonna push role-playing mechanics in this newer version of it. Here you can see on the top right, a trait system where I assign different traits based on the personality and languages of the different members of my family, as well as exploration of different environments, which is also through cards. So we're really leaning into abstraction in this version of the game, but it's still a very role-playing game. It still feels a lot like a simulation when I'm starting to play test it at the midpoint of last year. And I'm also finding that players are sometimes asking, can I change true events? What am I solving? Is this a mystery game? If you put a game in front of players, they immediately are trying to either look for two things often. One is how to break a game, or the other is how to speedrun a game, to beat it really quickly. And I think prototyping and playtesting really quickly is really good at this because it shows, without bells and whistles, you can get to the point where, based on the Twine prototype I just showed, you have an incredibly looking project, but it might feel hollow from a design perspective. It might feel like an illusion, and when the player gets close enough to touch the walls of it, they see that there's nothing solid. And I think one of the biggest goals of the game designer is to make sure that the room feels full, alive, and logical. And the way to do that often is through rules. So here we have the way that the game is continuing to evolve. It's still using the card game mechanics and the visuals that I showed previously, but now we're adding something that I like to call a job. You might also call it like a verb. A game is often based around verbs or actions that a player is doing. But in my experience, I have a lot of fun playing games that are vocational games. Power washing simulator games, farming games, there's all of these different types of games. And I think the idea for Normandie then was, what is it like to be a historian? And what is it like to be a descendant and someone peering into this past, rather than someone living it? And I think that immediately started to solve some of the ludonarrative dissonance that I was worried about, which is another gaming term referencing when the narrative and the mechanics have divergence. But it also helped me accomplish like the main goals of this project, which isn't to simulate reality, but to have the mechanical rules of the project replicate the refugee experience. And I think as a game designer, that's often the best thing that you can do, is capture the feeling rather than the reality of it through interesting toolkits and ways. And the thing that I'm happy with in the version that we're playing with now and are building towards a vertical slice with, is that the game's magic circle that I mentioned before, this space that the player steps into, it acknowledges the gaps. It's built around the gaps rather than having to have players not understand that. And I think one of the most interesting things for me working with memory and history in this format is working on games that acknowledge the limitations of games and invite players into that process of discovery. Okay, so a little bit more about the project's inspiration, partnerships, and other groups that I'm working with. When I started working on the project, my experience working on previous games, the Iranian Revolution game that I mentioned before, as well as other virtual reality projects, told me really quickly how much my New York City public school education had failed me in learning about world history curriculum, as well as how much new mediums are sort of failing younger audiences in terms of key buzzwords like empathy and impact. So here I have some statistics from the ADL that specifically focuses on online video games, on harassment, on white supremacist ideologies, on hateful speech. And I think this is really important to think about from a design perspective, even as someone who's not making a multiplayer game. Normandie is a single player game, but it exists inside of a larger cultural and global context. And a lot of times these people who are playing Normandie will be coming into it already primed or having these same types of experiences that people in the past might have had in different ways. So I think finding ways that you can tether the experience of a teenager in 2025 with a teenager in 1939 is really interesting to think about when it comes to the research as well. to accompany the game's launch on gaming platforms, working with an amazing organization based in New York as well called Games for Change that some of you might be familiar with. They're a leading edge think tank group working on games for impact, games for education. They're made up of a group of former New York City public school teachers and other nonprofit leaders. And with their assistance, I am working on a pilot program to use Normandie in New York City public schools at the beginning of next year, while the game is still in development, which is key for me. I think oftentimes when I've worked on games in the past where entrepreneurial teachers have approached us when we finished the game and asked about using the Iranian Revolution game in world history curriculum, and we were like, that's a great idea. And they said, do you have any lesson plans? And we were like, we're game designers, I don't know how to do that. So one of the things with Normandie was thinking about from the very beginning of it, partnering with institutions and groups to make sure that when people approach the project and communities want to use this game in their own processes, that I'm able to give them the resources to do that. Ultimately, students are going to be playing Normandie probably only an hour and a half of it in the classroom, and the game is likely to be like an 8 to 10 hour experience by the time it's done. So that's another issue that often comes up with using games in classroom environments. It's just like you roll through different modules so quickly, and games often take so long to play, unless they're like a very short experience, that integrating them, it's not as easy as watching a scene of a movie or even like a 2 hour long feature film. Also games that have different types of randomization, right? Like students might see different scenes, have access to different moments. And while some people would argue that that's a negative, I actually think that's a positive. Because again, you're putting the power into the students' hands. You're enabling them to have their own experiences in different bespoke ways. At the end of this pilot, I wanted to kind of hold ourselves accountable by also sharing results on a public-facing website that we're building. Think of it as like a white page that we're creating at the end of this that's also going to evaluate what went right and what went wrong. I think that's really, really helpful for other game makers working in the space. And I look forward to being a part of that community that's starting to build, that I've already had access to even being here over the past few days, which is amazing. Additionally, I think my ethos when it comes to game development is partnering with institutions that normally aren't a part of game development while preserving the game development part. I think sometimes game designers are hired by nonprofits, museums, and other institutions, but those are often work for hire. There's already a spec or a scope that's defined on, and I think gaming as an artistic platform benefits from collaboration with larger industries. So on Normandie, we have educational managers, program evaluator, historical consultant, academic consultant, as well as additional groups that we're continually working with. And these partnerships have been instrumental, right? Because I think I can give a couple examples, even in terms of us thinking about the game for the classroom pilot for 10th and 11th grade classrooms in New York, working with Josh, who's a Jewish studies professor at Wellesley, and he's a Jewish studies professor at Wellesley. We realized really quickly that it would be really easy to support some additional materials that would let us bring it into Jewish studies classrooms at a college level. And having that information now, as opposed to like 18 months from now and working through that iteratively, has allowed us to add that in really quickly and nimbly too. Audience. So this is like always the hard part for me to talk about, honestly, because I started with a pie in the sky way of being like, our audience is gamers. There's 1 billion gamers around the world. Everyone's gonna play this game. And I think the reality is if your audience is everyone, it's ultimately no one, is the common adage that people say. We do have pretty broad pillars that we're still playing with, education being the first that I mentioned. But the second that's really key for me is narrative game players. Historical game fans, there's other types of groups. As an aside, I've met a ton of people when I talk about the Normandie in the 1930s that are obsessed with oceanic and ocean liner travel and have given me their own maps and resources and things that they've collected. So I also realize there's like a big nautical community out there that loves this type of era specifically. Sometimes I describe it as Jewish Titanic as a shorthand with people to help them with that. But I think the exciting thing for me about gamers is that this is a game that's going to reach people that have little to no previous Holocaust education. So there's a lot of pressure and intent that we have to think about as designers, right? So that when people are coming into this with an elementary or no education about this at all, that we feel like we're designing this intentfully, but that we're also not fulfilling the role of education. And then thirdly, public partnerships. So this is museums and other impact-driven partners that I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. And this is everything from gaming showcases like Games for Change, to GDC, to events like this and other types of showcases that we have opportunities to show the game at. This is something cool that we did last year at Games for Change in New York, which is building an installation prototype of the game itself. This installation was actually designed by my sister, so it's truly a family affair, this project. And what we did here is I used some family artifacts to curate an exhibit. The luggage in the bottom left is luggage from my family. We rented a typewriter, found this old 1920s radio on Facebook Marketplace, which was great to find old props, much cheaper than a prop house, highly recommend it. And also created videos and had brief components of the game showable at this showcase. And I think what was really interesting about the game, placing the game in this type of physical environment for me, was for a game that's based on tactile inspiration and on these, again, I've heard it mentioned a lot over the past few days, like object-driven storytelling and creating experiences that are driven around artifacts and the remnants. This gave like a really core experiential memory for players and people that experience this. We specifically targeted this installation at, for educators and for nonprofits, so this was less developed for gamers themselves. I think a gamer version of this would look like actually printing the cards we have in the game and trying to create some type of physical version of the game that feels playable, whether it's through the different card games that they're playing or different mechanics of it. But I would really want to find a way to gamify and make it feel interactive in a fun way and not just like a museum installation piece. I've spoken to a few museums, and it's also been really interesting for me, even being here at the expo, talking with partners in museums, because my expectation of museums sometimes is like, okay, like I can put an iPad in a space and people are going to play it. And these museums have given me amazing feedback that's like, that's not going to happen. Like you can't just put an iPad in a room and expect people to engage with it. So I think thinking about call to action activations for new audiences and what can bring new generations into these treasured institutions that already exist is one of the really exciting things for me about the project post-launch. Timeline. So I mentioned it before, the game is in production right now. We've been in production for over a year. We have the classroom pilot that we're going to be rolling out in the beginning of next year. Our plan right now, my joke with game development is a game is never done until you run out of time or money, are the two things that often happen. So summer 2026 is our target to launch on Steam, when we'll also be launching our public-facing curriculum website, as well as starting to do global showcases at film festivals and other events. Through the summer, we'll be working then on a mobile version of the game. We're building the game using Unity, so it's fairly easy to port it to new platforms. I think what I'm really interested in beyond that is localization and the ability to target new audiences through Steam and other platforms. For example, I think it's been mentioned by a couple of other talks here, but almost half, I think it's over half of all audiences on Steam now are based in China. So even releasing the game in Mandarin and in languages and audiences that have very little access, who are very likely to have never met a Jew or have an understanding of the Holocaust, but have connections to different genocides and immigration stories, I think is a really interesting thing for us to target as well. And then what we're looking towards at the end of 2026 onwards is console expansion, starting to experiment with these museum installations that I mentioned before, as well as curating impact campaigns around our educational and cultural goals of the project. Yeah, so this is our closing slide that I have here. I'm going to leave my info up here in case, feel free to get in touch or talk with me after this talk. But we're specifically, I would say here at Landecker, interested in opportunities to talk with educators, with exhibition opportunities, and also global distribution beyond the United States. I think one of the benefits for me with this project has been getting to globetrot a little bit and learn from the different memory cultures of different European countries. And I think as a younger country and a city of immigrants, New York, but a city that also continually reinvents itself, I think we don't do the best job of shepherding the past, and it's been really exciting, fulfilling, and interesting for me to learn from different groups and cultures that are here as well. And yeah, then I threw in a picture of me that a classroom project with my grandfather. Technically I've been researching this game for 25 years, so I'll stick to that part of it as well. And yeah, thank you all so much for attending. That's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions or show additional info about the game if that would be helpful.
Brilliant, thank you, Sam. Really interesting. So, yeah, do we have any questions?
Yeah, this is great. I really related to the slide that talked about the limitations of using digital games that are multiple hours long in a classroom. It's something I've thought about a lot too. How are you breaking up Normandie into some sort of like chapter structure? Like how do you manage that? Because that's something I think that there is a lot of things I've seen when talking about games that have educational content is it seems like there's this push to make them really, really short. And I feel like that's never enough time to really get your skin in the game and to really like invest yourself and feel the stakes of what you're doing. And so I think there's real value to games being longer, but then you come up against this reality of like, oh yeah, like people have to actually have the context to consume it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we are thinking about it in terms of chapters. So it's like 4 chapters that are presenting different components of the voyages in almost a Rashomon style where it's different perspectives of it. So inside of that is like a module that feels the most applicable for classroom education, which is like focused on kindertransport and children themselves, because I'm targeting an age group that's like a teenage age group. So it feels like that section of the game is probably like, if I was to pick one that's about an hour long that feels good and targeted from that element of it. And I think what's fun about that too then is if it's broken up into those modules, it also gives us like A/B testing a little bit, right? To like try, if we expand this pilot later upon the game's release, to like, how did that work versus how did that work in different elements of it. But I totally agree with your assessment of length versus like entertainment value, because I've also had the experiences, a lot of the games that I've worked on, which are very narrative cinematic games, they take 5 years to make and they're like 2 to 3 hours long, right? They're very cinematic, motion capture, actors, voices, all of these things. And I think with Normandie, one of the things for me was like stripping it down to the essentials and building up from there to see what I could get away with that sort of apophenial method of storytelling. I think what's interesting to your point too is games are probably like the only medium that people won't buy something because it's shorter. Like it's a funny, like no one would not go see a movie. No one would pay more for a 3 hour long movie than they would for like an hour and a half long movie. Like there's not that type of equation, but games have a very cost basis value set for it. And I think that's actually changing because I'm noticing with younger generations, like the push away from this narrative gaming structure. People want to spend more and more time. I think there's some statistic that you might have seen too that's like, I think 60% of all game playing time is spent in games that are more than 5 years old. So that means people are just continuing to play Grand Theft Auto 5 online, Fortnite, like these games, because they've invested a lot of time and energy in it. And it would seem like that would take 1,000 hours to bring that into a new game. So I think there is like a sweet spot. I think independent games are very good at this, where like you can work with a team of 4 or 5 people like I'm doing, target a length of somewhere between like 6 to 12 hours, give people enough bang for their buck when it comes to the price for entry, but also let them leave when they're done with it and not present this evergreen experience that needs to be continually updated and supported with new content. We're open to that, but I think independent games have I equate them often to, as a former film student where film was in the 1990s with Sundance and these festivals that started to emerge where there was this, there were these cultural institutions, but there was also this financial capital. There were these companies buying these independent movies and releasing them across the world to mainstream audiences. And independent games we're sort of at the end of that cycle, I think, for games, where like, there's like the discoverability problem that's happening on platforms, but I think there's still an opportunity and a possibility in what you're talking about. So, yeah.
Anyone else?
I was just interested in the actual card game mechanics.
Yeah.
Would you be able to explain a little bit more about them?
Yeah, so it initially started as based on I'm sure we're all familiar with like different it's funny when I talk about solitaire with people, I realize everyone had their own like house rules that their family played, which is another interesting metaphor that I'm playing with here. But we started, I've played like 200 different solitaire games, Klondike, Spider, so many. And one of the things about the older ones that I've found is that they're really hard. Like the solvability is like 15%. So most games you can't beat when you play them. And I think when you're playing the actual card games, like when you were playing them growing up or when you're younger, there's an element, because the card games are somewhat random, that it's like when you win, you feel like a genius. And when you lose, you're like, well, it was random. I had a bad deal, I couldn't win. So there's a degree of like buy-in and buy-out either way. So the inspiration and the genesis for the card games in Normandy then is we're using these archival playing card games, but the player's manipulating the rules of these games to make them easier, to make them more solvable. So as you're playing the game, you're getting better at the game within the game, but we're also continually changing the rules as a metaphor for the rules being changed for the refugee experience, things that you have to do, things that you have to add to your deck, new rules being. So we're playing with a little bit of like a roguelike mechanic, if anyone's familiar with that type of game, which is a game where every time you start, you have a different, it's randomized, you have different cards. So the narrative component of it is relatively set, but we all have these interstitials and ways to complicate the narrative through the card games that you're building and playing while you're doing it. But yeah, it's a little bit of a hybrid that it's an exciting possibility space, but it's also something that has been interesting to test with younger audiences who have maybe never played solitaire before in their life, right? And are intrinsically, it's like a fun game. Like card games are fun for all audiences, and I think we've all had experiences playing them on trips, like even when we can't access the internet, on our phones, like while we're traveling. So I think finding ways to make it feel crunchy while also paying homage to the older versions of it is like an interesting problem space to solve for. So that's like, the joke with an independent game is normally you have like one or two new things you can do. So I feel like that's our new thing to do, is like make old games fun through a new game format.
It's really interesting.
Yes.
I have a question. So since you mentioned that you're trying to restrict yourself in the form, so everything will be cards, are you planning on making a physical card game at some point?
It's a good question. So one thing that I didn't mention is, in addition to Claims Conference and the Maimonides Fund and the nonprofit partners, the game is fiscally sponsored by a Jewish nonprofit, Reboot, that's based in the United States as well, which is actually like a very strange way to make a video game from a partnership standpoint, to work with a nonprofit. But one of their ideas as an impact campaign has been to create these kits of the physical card decks that we would send out to people, both journalists, but also for these activations and create versions of it. If we start to the question before, if the rules start, if it starts to get, there are some of the components of the card game are like too difficult to replicate, to operate it would be really difficult to do that yourself. You would have to have like a 5-page thing to access and parts of it, but I think that playing with that element of it is really fun too. So we've printed versions of the cards as like a deck of cards, just as a test of it, because I think it's kind of fun to play with. And we have incredible like period Art Deco illustrations too that I think would just look really cool in that format. So I think it would be fun.
Anyone else got any? While I'm having a bit of a think, I was quite, obviously you've been talking a lot about the collaborators and people and advisors who've been working on this. I was interested also in your previous games. Is that something you've come to develop, or from the beginning have you always been engaging with others, or is it sort of learned experience, as it were?
Yeah, I think I grew up in New York, so I was in a city that has 8 million lived experiences all around, and I think what's the voyeur in me was always really just excited about escaping into other stories. And I think games are, people talk about it as an escapist medium, but I think documentaries are too. So I think there's a lot, there's a lot of convergence even in the idea of making a documentary is often like you don't know where you are at the start of it, and by the end of it, hopefully you've like changed or moved the thesis statement a little bit, and I think I'm drawn to those types of stories personally. So I think I try to replicate that in games, that it's like where the game starts versus where it ends. It's like you've shown players the process in some type of way, and I think it's like a trust thing that I kind of like in some ways too. But yeah, it's a good question.
That's good.
Yeah.
Anyone else have anything they'd like to ask? I mean, if there's nothing you want to add, I think we can probably wrap up because it also will give you extra time to go down, and you've got a pilot version running down.
Yeah, so the Twine prototype that I showed before is running down at the arcade, which you would love people to check out and love to get feedback on. I did sort of like a retro of it in this presentation, but I'm happy to receive other feedback too on it. Like it's still something that we're using and testing against like different versions of the game that we have. Maybe like the one last thing that I'll add in addition to the Twine prototype is I think what's really interesting about games, and when we talk about limitations too, is like, and I think I was trying to touch on this with that Sam Lake quote that I put in a little bit earlier, but like Wikipedia and all these other things exist. And what's interesting about a game, I think, if that we tried in the Twine version and are exploring in different versions in the full game, is like I don't think you need to put the World Wide Web inside of a game, which is maybe what I was trying to do initially. I think if you can activate someone's curiosity and give them enough that they'll Google what happened to the Normandie, they'll Google who is the Dreyfus family, they'll Google, it'll send them on their own mosaic journey of it, is the better of those two alternatives. So I think that's something that I've learned the hard way over the course of like 10 years of development too, and didn't manage to include it in the presentation, so wanted to just drop that in as a note as well. But yeah, please come check out the game. Thank you all so much for coming to this talk.
Cool. Thanks, Alan.